Now we're going to move to the more, I'll call it experimental phase of the day. We're going to have a moderated panel discussion. So the participants who've all been introduced and who've had an opportunity to explain about their work and how they frame the issues will be asked a series of questions. The intent is not to rush through the questions and get to them all, but it's to engender a dialogue amongst us all. So the person will be asked a question on the panel. Everybody will have the opportunity to, who feels the need and who has an issue to raise, will be able to ask for clarifications or to make a comment. And the intent is really to compare cross-culturally and cross-countries and jurisdictions, what's happening in the diverse areas of the world geographically where you all work. Okay? So, Sister Patricia, you're leaving us. You are going to be my first question recipient. That's okay, I'll catch you when you come back. It was the theory that the last should be first. Okay, so the first question relates to, we skipped over the anti-human trafficking coordinator from the EU's question and answer. So the first question relates to her presentation. And I would like to know, starting with Minister Dishaba, what are your impressions and your reactions to her framing of the issues? And do you feel like the EU can collaborate differently with Ghana, or can there can be a more constructive collaboration than currently exists?
Yeah, thank you very much. The thing is to get our people to have a sense of worth, sense of value of who they are. I've met quite a number of girls who we rescued, and after a while they went back in spite of the trauma that they had gone through, because they don't have a sense of worth. They think that greener pastures are outside of home, like she was saying. But there is no place like home. A developing country has various challenges, but home is the safest place. So we can collaborate with them to ensure that we inspire patriotism and a sense of worth of who you are as an African. Or poor people must have dignity. They must have principles. You cannot say that because you're poor, you have no dignity, you have no sense of value, no sense of worth, and you are abused, and because of the pittance that you are getting, you continue to be abused. In the end, you might die. And this is a loved one. This is a breadwinner. This is a future developer of our countries. So it will be very good for us to collaborate them and educate teachers with her training manual so that in the school it becomes part of the curriculum to teach patriotism, to teach a sense of worth of who you are. I'm from Ghana. I lived in England for 20 years, but I went back home because I wanted to be a part of Ghana and the development. I created a program in education to educate our people about wanting to be somebody, wanting to be an achiever. I wrote another program to work in very deprived communities, to give people in rural Ghana a sense of worth. And that's what moved me into politics and brought me to become a minister. If you understand who you are, it doesn't matter where you go. You'll always understand that home is the best place. And that's what we need to teach our people from developing countries and from rural parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to pass the question to Dr. Abu Bakar. I'm wondering if you have the same impression in Nigeria, that it's an internal issue about building self-worth.
Just like what Sister said, that the NAPTIP, which I created, you know, they are trying to bring this into school. I mean, teaching of woman trafficking. You know, they want to include it in our curriculum. And one thing, again, I think we work out is that, you know, there are no laws. And, you know, our countries are very, very porous. If there are laws in our countries, like, you know, like the one we have in Nigeria, because a child in Nigeria can get up and go to Ghana, you know, trafficked through the borders and so on and so forth. So if there are laws in these countries, I think it will help a great deal.
Please, Ms. Ackerman.
I said that politics are sometimes very tricky. I know a country in Africa, they say the primary school is free from charge, so everybody could go. But the children who have not made a schooling at 3 year, at 4 year, at 5 year, cannot be accepted in the primary school. And this school fees is very expensive for the small people, small kids. So it doesn't help the poor people that the primary school is free of charge when the before primary school is very expensive. So the poor are falling out.
Thank you, please.
Muy buenas tardes, Ana Paula García de Bolivia. La pregunta, o tal vez un aporte, va dirigido para la hermana Patricia. Por ejemplo, en Bolivia se está abordando lo que es la prevención individual, sí, como el empoderamiento, pero también debemos de abordar una prevención integral, una prevención desde el ámbito estructural, cómo podemos desestructurar ciertos roles de género establecidos, una prevención institucional, cómo se le saca ese sesgo de género planteado dentro del ámbito de la justicia, dentro del ámbito de la administración, dentro del ámbito de los distintos niveles del Estado para la asignación presupuestaria, por ejemplo, así como también una prevención comunitaria, cómo se trabaja con la comunidad, cómo yo le hago entender a esa persona que cuando va y demanda sexo no es un cliente, sino es un prostituyente, y cómo esa situación normalizada, esa situación naturalizada se va cambiando. Y también cuando hablábamos de los contextos favorables, de que decíamos de que la pobreza no es la causa o no son las principales causas de la trata, pero sí son contextos favorables. La pobreza, la violencia sexual, la violencia familiar, la educación, la falta de educación sexual, los embarazos adolescentes. Entonces, ¿cómo trabajar la problemática desde la prevención, pero desde una prevención integral, para que se puedan abordar los distintos ámbitos? Gracias.
You have many excellent questions that I should add to my list for the panelists. The first example that I've heard of institutionalizing and doing something structurally about the problem is from our Nigerian colleagues, talking about teaching about anti-human trafficking schools. That's the first time I've ever heard about that, and I think that's a wonderful example. I'm wondering if any of our other panelists have examples to share where they've seen mechanisms such as that to inform and to educate. Please, Dr. Vasilyadou.
Well, as I am representing an institution here, I guess I can give an example from what the European Union is doing. The legislation is not, I'm not speaking as a Eurocrat, I'm saying something that I think is obvious to people across the world, that the legislation on trafficking by the EU is very innovative and is very comprehensive, and it deals with these aspects that you're addressing. We also had a study on the gender dimension of trafficking where we explain exactly how institutions and how countries and how governments can engage in a structural, in a systematic way to address these issues. But one of my concerns here is that, of course, prevention means a lot of things. And it means that we catch the criminals, it means that we address the abusers, it means that we prevent, as the sister said, the girls or the women or the men or the boys from becoming trafficked in the first place. I would just draw caution so that we don't put even more responsibility to the people who are trafficked by saying that, you know, they are poor, so they end up in this situation. No, they are vulnerable, but it is the traffickers we need to be focusing on and the abusers. And if we really fail to do that, I hope I managed to say that in my speech. Unfortunately, in the next few years, we won't be able to completely eradicate poverty. Unfortunately, this has to be our main priority. But in the meantime, we can stop the criminal networks not only with legislation, and yes, there are laws in many countries, but the question is, are they implemented? I want to know how many of those exploiters and profit makers and criminals have been caught by the justice systems in the various countries, and I want to know how many financial investigations resulted in those people going to jail, because for one guy is many times a male trafficker, not only, there are hundreds of victims. So where is this man or woman who exploits? So I think this is important to think about, and institutions and member states and countries and governments can do a lot to stop that, if they want.
Please.
Gracias. Bueno, mi nombre es Alicia Perezuti, yo vengo de una organización que trabaja contra la trata hace 20 años. A mí me parece que acá hay dos ejes fundamentales. Por un lado, que no lo estamos planteando. Por un lado, el acceso real de las mujeres al trabajo, ¿sí? Cuando la hermana hablaba de prevención y hablaba de oportunidades, realmente las oportunidades que tienen o que tenemos las mujeres de conseguir trabajo, que no sea prostitución, y las mujeres que están en prostitución, cómo poder salir de la prostitución a través de un trabajo digno, ¿sí? Porque la prostitución no es trabajo. Por otro lado, creo que tenemos que hacer más hincapié en el cliente. Creo que habría que pensar, Margaret, en un próximo, por favor, perdón Margaret, yo sé que vos me querés mucho y me vas a disculpar que te haga cargo de esto, pero habría que pensar en un próximo simposio, hablar de la demanda, hablar del cliente, porque muy pocos países se ha penalizado. Nosotros en Argentina lo hemos intentado y no hemos podido avanzar, porque aquellos políticos que aprueban las leyes y que las proponen son los que por ahí consumen. Entonces, si no penalizamos al cliente, como se logró en Suecia, y en Francia, creo que no vamos a poder avanzar mucho en este tema. Creo que también coincido con ella en cuanto a los traficantes y todo lo demás, pero creo que los países en persecución penal del delito han avanzado bastante. Hemos avanzado, pero el problema es la cultura. El problema son el acceso real de las mujeres al trabajo, a oportunidades, para aquellas que no están y para aquellas que están en prostitución, y realmente qué hacemos con la demanda. A ver, dentro de estos ejes también está la educación, ¿no? Para cambiar la crianza de los varones, ¿sí? Pero a ver, si no penalizamos al cliente, vamos a seguir considerando que está bien socialmente, porque la demanda de prostitución está considerada por nuestra sociedad como algo aceptado. Muchísimas gracias.
I think the issue is not so much that we're not talking about prosecutions in this meeting, it's just that the focus in the last meeting, as I recall, was specifically on prosecutions. So this focus is specifically on how can we do better in terms of resettlement, how can we get more compensation to the victims, how can we find them jobs, how can we help them restore them with dignity. But we still appreciate your comments, very pointed. I believe, Stella Odife, you had your hand.
I'm Stella Odife from Nigeria, a legal practitioner, and I run an NGO. I just want to correct the legal implication of, unfortunately, today is not my turn to talk. We are discussing legal issues tomorrow. We have a very comprehensive law on trafficking in Nigeria. So I stand to say it's not the law that is the problem. It's implementation of the law should be the main focus of our problem. We also have what we call the Child Rights Act. The Child Rights Act took comprehensive look at the disadvantaged position of children with their parents. And I think if managed properly with the trafficking law we have in place, we'll go a long way to solve our problem legally. But secondly, I had a lot saying poverty is not the problem. I beg to disagree extensively. And I still maintain it that poverty is the main cause of trafficking. If maybe not in your country, maybe from the civilized area, you think it's not. But we in the system know that poverty is the main thing that is attracting the victims. It is good enough. If you think, let's say, think back a couple of years back, I'm happy you said today about 60 or 600% increase Nigerians are trafficked. The situation, the economic recession has given rise to this increase. So it is, the fundamental thing is poverty. We must focus on advising those countries, look into the countries. The presidents of those in governance should do something about improving the economy. That is the only way we can seriously tackle the issue of the victims. When we come to the traffickers themselves, it's a different ballgame. We have a comprehensive law in Nigeria, and what we need to do is to find ways of implementing it away from the agency, a government agency that has a lukewarm attitude. We need to incorporate a lot of NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I saw a flurry of hands. Minister, and then I believe Ms. Torres Herrero.
Yeah, thank you. Is it on? The lack of enforcement of the law. We have a lot of laws in Ghana, gender policy, children's rights, persons with disability, child and family welfare, FQ, many laws. But the enforcement, there's a gap between the law and the enforcement. And the enforcement is not happening because partly of our culture, that the victim or the person abusing the victim is usually a family member. And so when you report it, then they feel that you have disgraced the family. And so it's important for the perpetrators to be named and shamed, and for the victims to be empowered to have confidence that it's okay to report. And then the legal system, there is a delay between the time that the person is trafficked and the time that the issue is sent to court. And so there's a lot of time for the family to work on the mind of the victim. And we have to keep them in shelters. By the time the delays occur, they're tired, and sometimes they have to go back home and all of that. So the gap between the laws and the enforcement is something that we must look at. The issue of poverty. For anybody to sell their child for $6, for anybody to sell their child, a bag of rice in Ghana is about $42, and people sell their children for less than that. A goat in Ghana is more expensive than a child. That is an act of pure desperation from a family, and that is poverty. And even when you take them out of poverty, you must continue to keep them out of poverty, because any issues of getting them back into poverty will push them to going back, like the girls that I met who had been rescued, who went back because when they got home, they didn't have the economic resources to do the things that they wanted. So the SDGs must be put in. We must achieve the reduction of poverty to be able to protect our people. It must be a holistic program. It cannot be done individually, that people are taken out of it, rescued, they are trained. They must be out of poverty. It is a key issue for developing countries.
Thank you. I have to only take Ms. Herrera's question, and then I'm happy to see all of this talking, because that's the goal, is to get everybody talking. But if I go late, then we'll miss coffee, and then people will be upset. So one more question, then we'll come back and we have more questions. Or one more.
Muchas gracias. Yo quería hacer una pregunta a Miriam Vassiliadou. Con respecto a su intervención, me gustó muchísimo la referencia que hizo a la buena utilización de los términos. Estoy un poco preocupada cuando oigo hablar indiferentemente de trata, de formas modernas de esclavitud. He llegado a oír hablar también de explotación forzada, que no entiendo mucho cómo la explotación puede ser forzada. Que quisiera saber, porque creo que la trata tiene muchas formas diferentes y utilizar un mismo término como puede ser esclavitud moderna, que está bien y está claro que es esclavitud moderna, también es un término invisibilizador de lo que se esconde detrás de esa esclavitud, de lo que significa la trata. Tampoco existe una definición internacional de esclavitud moderna, mientras que sí que existe una definición internacional de trata y de explotación sexual. Quería saber qué es lo que opinaba Miriam a este respecto y si ella piensa, porque últimamente estamos hoy incluso oyendo hablar, por ejemplo, de organizaciones como la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que también hablan de formas de esclavitud moderna. Entonces podemos llegar a pensar, es que, por ejemplo, la explotación sexual, la prostitución es un trabajo, o existe la explotación, la prostitución forzada, la prostitución libre. Creo que hay una amalgama de términos, hay una confusión de términos, y esta confusión nos lleva a una invisibilización de la realidad que hay detrás, que es una verdadera vulneración de los derechos humanos. Quería saber qué pensaba Miriam.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to cut here for coffee break, and we'll allow Miriam some time to think about that over coffee. Maybe that is one role of this group, is that we could come up with new definitions if this group determines that they're needed. Just throwing that out there. But in the meantime, enjoy your coffee.
Okay, can I just remind colleagues that we come back in about 25 minutes to the room, so we can keep to schedule. Thank you.
And I believe Dr. Vassiliadou would like to respond.
Yes, thank you very much. There were two quick comments. The first comment relates to the work that we're doing with our African colleagues. As I said, the EU is the biggest humanitarian donor in the world. And what I'd like to inform is that we have, the African Union has contributed to the Global Compact on Migration, and it has contributed and adopted the same approach as the EU. So everything I was saying normally is also adopted by the African Union. On the 8th and 9th of November, there is in Luxor a big meeting of the so-called Rabat process, whereby they will be discussing child victims and especially assistance and protection of victims, as we discussed today. Ghana and Nigeria are amongst the countries that received very significant funding under the EU Trust Fund for Africa. I have a link to a website. This is publicly accessible, and I'd like to, I hope that we can facilitate so I can share this with you. So the question is not always the lack of funds, but is how the funds reach those in need, the victims. We're here today to talk about this, and what stands between the protection and assistance of victims is funds. Funds from the EU have been very, very generously distributed. So I think the question is, as the Minister says, to see how we can best implement all the discussions and dialogues and agreements that have already been reached. This is an important question. And then I had a question on terminology. According to EU law, I represent the EU, and I'm the EU anti-trafficking coordinator. I have a mandate to work on human trafficking. We have a Palermo Protocol under the UN. We have EU law. We have the EU treaty, or explicitly stipulating human trafficking as a crime and as a human rights violation. And human trafficking is very clearly described. It's a very broad definition that embraces and takes into consideration different forms of exploitation. What I think is important to note is that, sparing the law now and the details of the law, not all slaves could be considered as victims of human trafficking, and not all victims of human trafficking should be considered as slaves. Modern slaves, I don't know. I haven't come across that in the law that I have studied. So I cannot say more. I can say that sometimes these terms are useful, but not for the prosecution, protection, and assistance of victims. Maybe they're useful when it comes to communicating a global phenomena that embrace many different phenomena, including crimes, exploitation, different elements. But if we are here to discuss human trafficking, then the law is extremely clear. And I don't think we need to go further than that. A lot of the victims that the IOM, the International Organization on Migration, identified in Italy that I talked about before, could not be considered as slaves. Modern slaves, I don't know what that is, so I couldn't talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify, Ms. Herrero, did you still have a standing question for Ms. Minty, or has your question been addressed? Okay, then I saw Gregoire's hand in the air. Mr. Gregoire had a...
Thank you very much. I just would like to come back to the notion of status of victim, because we all stand for access to justice, access to rights, access to reparation, financial compensation, access to healing, and access to alternative incomes. But that requires a strong and consistent victim status. It requires a status. And the point I would like to make is that this status of victim cannot be developed and cannot be isolated, disconnected from the broader legal environment and legal framework. And that's why I think we have to articulate the status of victim and the broader legislation. And I will give just 3 examples, and I would like to make reference to some of the wealthiest countries in the world, because Mr. Haugen made reference to the challenges in the developing countries, but I will give examples of 3 countries, and I will start with mine, then with yours and a neighbor country, so France, the USA, and Germany. In France, we very recently fully revisited our legislation, but until 2016, victims of trafficking for sexual exploitations were primarily considered as illegal migrants to be expelled. How can you access any of the rights we want to develop and discuss here if you are primarily considered as an illegal migrant and not a victim of trafficking for sexual exploitation? In the USA, in many states, victims of trafficking human beings are primarily considered as criminals, including minors. They are not protected. They are arrested, fined, sometimes detained. In Germany, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation exploited in legal brothels are primarily considered as happy sex workers and not victims of trafficking human beings. They are in legal brothels, licensed, their employers are sex entrepreneurs, but de facto, they are victims of trafficking. And what I'm saying here is that if we want to develop a consistent and powerful status of victim, we have to address the whole spectrum of the legislation and the legal environment on trafficking. Because otherwise, there will always be primacy given to another status. Well, in Europe, you're above all a migrant, an illegal migrant. In the US, you're above all a criminal. And in many countries, Netherlands and Germany, well, before, above all, you are an individual agent with a powerful agency, which is not the truth in the end, you are a victim of sexual exploitation. So I completely understand that we will focus here on this status, but I just would like to make this point that we can't isolate it from the legal environment. And that's why I have the luck to present the French legislation tomorrow. That's why I think this status of victim has to be developed in a broad legislative reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregoire. We're looking forward to hearing about that tomorrow. Ms. Farley.
Okay. Thank you. I want to recognize that I come from a dominant country that has far more privilege than Nigeria, and where there's not the overwhelming poverty. However, I would like to make this point that when I was in Lusaka about a decade ago, the unemployment rate was devastatingly high. People were very poor, people were hungry, and yet women were prostituting and men were selling pencils and washing windshields of cars. What is that about? That's about sexism. And it's such an important issue for the following reason. If we're talking about healing, then we must address the viciously inserted sexist degradation, humiliation, and hatred of women that's put into the mind and the body of those who are prostituted. That's necessary for healing. And the sexism is part of the bars on the cage that keeps people in a scenario of being trafficked for the purpose of prostitution. I would just like to point out that we're talking about sex trafficking in large part here. I'll talk about labor trafficking at a later point, but I want to make this point about sexism and poverty operating together in the lives of women to cause harm.
Father Bailly.
Yes, Gregory brings up a point about the varying different standards between the countries. And coming from the United States, we have many different views of the value of a human person. And no one talks about the fact that now we are harvesting human organs in abortion clinics and selling them. No one talks about the fact that we decide when an elderly person, life is no longer of value, and we decide when they die. We decide which babies get to be born and which don't. They call it a fetal mass, but leave that alone and it's going to come out a human being, not a turnip. And so now we're talking about the dignity of a human person, whether it's male, female, black, white, gay, straight, Muslim, Christian, whatever. The value of a human person has been so devalued. And so we live in a society where we can say we can kill our old people, we can kill our unborn. In the United States, we're very violent about many different things, but I can't sell a whole 12-year-old. I can cut up unborn babies and sell them in pieces, but I can't sell, and I'm not favoring any of it. I'm saying it's a question of human dignity, and everyone's talking about rights. And how do you force people to face the rights of certain people and ignore the rights that are so horribly abused by others? And I think that's a fundamental question at the heart of our fight. If we're going to allow the government or an individual to decide who lives and who dies, then the fact that someone is trafficked is going to be a matter of opinion and a matter of a value system that they can get away with. And everyone's passion about the rights of these people who've been so victimized, I'm with you 100%. But we need to take it the whole way and not segment it and make it just this area that we're concerned about. This is the dignity of the human person. And as long as we allow other human persons to be disrespected and to be valueless, I don't think we'll ever deal with the question as long as the dignity of every human person is not respected.
I'm sorry, I can't see your nameplate from here.
Gracias. Primero, muchas gracias por la invitación, Marcelo, qué gusto estar aquí otra vez. Pues yo quisiera hacerle una pregunta abierta al panel, o varias preguntas, depende cómo las tomen. Estoy de acuerdo con Alicia que una de las cosas que tenemos que trabajar es la demanda. Ya sé que podremos organizar algo después, entonces me voy a centrar un poco en la ley que han estado hablando, una ley que criminaliza, y lo digo por la experiencia que tengo a trabajar con proxenetas. Ellos me decían que si uno cae en la cárcel, 10 más estarán formándose. Esto porque ellos conocen muy bien las leyes. Ellos, cuando hacen alguna modificación a la ley, ellos tienen un grupo de abogados para ayudar a sofisticar su oficio. El caso que tengo es el de México, padrotes tlaxcaltecas de México que están siendo apresados en Estados Unidos. Hay muchos arrestos en Estados Unidos y eso los ha llevado a sofisticar su oficio. Entonces, lo que dicen ellos es cambiar la forma de operar. Si antes ellos ocupaban la violencia física, pasan ahora a una violencia emocional, lo que devela es una fuerte alianza entre el sistema capitalista y el sistema patriarcal. Entonces yo preguntaría, ¿qué programas hay para reeducar a los proxenetas que están en la cárcel? Es decir, ¿cómo podemos apostarle a una prevención de tipo cuaternario? Es decir, ¿cómo aquellos, no solo es centrarnos en las víctimas y cómo las reintegramos, sino también cómo evitamos que estos hombres que están en la cárcel sigan en contacto con sus familiares, con sus amigos y les estén dando las claves para que no caigan los nuevos padrotes en la cárcel, los nuevos proxenetas? Entonces, esa es la pregunta, ¿cómo hacemos una prevención cuaternaria con los hombres que están tras las rejas? Gracias.
Thank you. I noticed some of you are not using your headsets, and I just wanted to make sure people were aware that we have them. They're in the little tray underneath, and then you can push number 2 if you need English, number 1 for Spanish. Okay. Joseph, you had your hand up.
I'm really enjoying this conversation, and we're talking on a macro level, which is great. It's the reason why we're here, and there's a lot of socioeconomic reasons why human trafficking occurs. But I've attended quite a few of these conferences around the world, and one of the things that, I haven't really done it yet, but I'm doing it now, is to kind of bring it down to earth and not to discourage the conversation that's going on, but to address that we have to address the problem now with the tools that we have, while simultaneously addressing the larger issue. So when you look at something like poverty, poverty is a big contributor to allowing for the environment for human trafficking to occur in a country like Nigeria or sub-Saharan Africa. But if you take a country like Canada, it occurs in Canada as well with middle class and upper class families. The method and the medium that the traffickers use is different. They contact them by way of social media, apps, Facebook, shopping malls. So the demand is definitely a big contributor to this, but it's going to be very difficult to attack gender equality, poverty, the list goes on, all while trying to combat human trafficking at the same time. These are huge shifts, paradigm shifts that are going to have to take place. And I don't mean that we shouldn't try fighting the good fight, but we should, at the same time, really focus our efforts to doing what we can while we address the bigger problem. So that's, speaking with, in Toronto Police, Sex Crimes Unit Detective Sergeant gives examples to try to really deter from the concept that trafficking happens transnationally with individuals that are not your neighbor. They happen in every country around the world. And we need to, for lack of a better word, start prosecuting, start putting people in jail. Criminalizing is not going to exactly end it, but it's going to send a message. And the final thing I'll end on, and what I'm seeing in the US, which is great, is a way of increasing knowledge and indirectly shaming people who participate in prostitution by really making them aware, saying, do you know when you go out and maybe it's legal in your country and you purchase the services of a prostitute, that they may actually be a trafficked individual? And it really starts to broaden, I think, a lot of people's mindset, saying, I might not just be, having a one-night stand here that I'm paying for that's fully legal. I may be participating in something that's entirely on another level that I don't want to be associated with. So I think that we really have to do our part on the small battles so we can get to the big ones.
Thank you, Joseph. You've really tied a lot of our loose ends together very well, I think. So a hand right in front of me, Ms. Moran.
Okay, my name is Rachel Moran, and I'm from an organisation called Space International, which stands for Survivors of Prostitution Abuse Calling for Enlightenment. And the reason we call for enlightenment is because we know that it won't be until the world wakes up to what prostitution actually is as a system that we will get anything done about this problem. So I want to make a few remarks around the area of language, because I firmly believe that until we get the language right, we will get nothing else right. I think everything rests on the bedrock of correct language to describe what it is that we're dealing with here. First of all, the term sex work, as some of us will know, was coined by California pimps back in the 80s. So I would say to everybody with a stake in this issue, inside this room and outside of it, if you are using the language of sex work, you are doing the work of pimps for them. Unwittingly, innocently, but you're doing it all the same. So I would appeal to you to stop using that language. I would also say that the idea that prostitution is a sexual service is nonsense. It's absolute utter nonsense to suggest that sex is a service. Sex is not a service. It is a human exchange, and it cannot and should never be reduced to the status of a service. I know this through the experiences of my own life and the experiences that I witnessed in the lives of the women and girls that I was prostituted alongside in Dublin throughout the 90s. I have to say that when we talk about sex trafficking, something that we consistently miss is that sex trafficking is the only form of trafficking that exists to funnel people into an illegitimate industry. So we see horrific trafficking in multiple forms, people funneled into the fishing industry, into domestic servitude, etc. But prostitution is the only system where I would say people are trafficked into the situation that should not exist in the first place, and we have got to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to move on to our next question, which relates to a particular report that the United States produces every year, and some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. But the question is specific for our American panelists. The US State Department puts out an annual report on trafficking in persons, which is essentially a ranking of nations, assessing whether or not they are doing their best to combat trafficking, and their best being according to the US definition. So I want to ask our American panelists, in your opinion, what purpose does this report serve globally? And what changes have you seen come about as a result of this report? And a follow-up question, do you think that there is, if you do think that there's value in this report, do you think that another entity, perhaps less biased, might be able to do a better job at it? So it's a loaded question, and I'd like to start with Corbin, who I see pondering the issue.
Putting me right on the spot. So from my perspective, I think that the Trafficking in Persons report can be an important lever for change. It can incentivize countries that otherwise are uninterested in dealing with the issue, provide incentives for them to tackle the issue. And I think we can, we have seen examples of countries that have made changes as a result of either low rankings or wanting to avoid lower rankings. At the same time, I think that it is important, and I think for those of us that do work in the U.S., to realize that the report is only as strong as its reputation. And so that the report has to be credible, it has to have integrity. And I think that I would highlight two areas where I think that that has to be scrutinized. One is an honest ranking of the United States itself. I think that as many of you know, we had an interesting election take place fairly recently. And I think that, you know, there are certain domestic policies, particularly around immigration, that I think have to be carefully scrutinized over the next several years to see whether or not, in fact, they are increasing vulnerability. So I think it's something that needs to be monitored. The other thing, just broadly speaking, it's critical that when the State Department is ranking countries, that it is not doing so based on political considerations, based on trade or national security or anything like that. It has to be specific to the facts on the ground. And so in my role, as a representative also of Humanity United Action, my colleagues, my counterparts at IJM, the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking Coalition, we've been working over the past year specifically on legislation that would tighten up some of the requirements around the TIP report to specifically focus on the concrete actions a country has or has not taken, and for those to be the driving factors for what the tier rankings are. So to the extent possible, looking to try and take politics out and look at what a country is or is not doing in the specific reporting period. And I think doing so, I'm hopeful that that legislation will pass soon, and I think that will allow us to look at the report as something of integrity and credibility.
Oh, thank you. Sure.
About the TIP report. Yeah, I've got it, thank you. I would like to make a comment about the TIP report because it has been a source of frustration. And I bring to attention the component of human trafficking that is organ trafficking. And it is not, Mr. Teague, it is not addressed in the TIP report. So even as we speak, we're trying to influence Senator Corker and Congress to make some address of that. The report could have of great value if it had leverage with governments to address the issue of human trafficking, let alone the fact that there is organ trafficking. So I don't direct this in any personal way to you, but if I may bring to attention of this group, which we commend for its activity, certainly the TIP report is a location of importance, but regrettably, frustratingly inadequate, that it doesn't either, one, really bring the issue to governments to make reform, or two, even address the fact that there is organ trafficking in the world, and it doesn't acknowledge or mention it. Thank you, I could make that comment.
Thank you. That is a mystery, why that's not addressed. Gregoire, please.
Let me be an American citizen for 2 seconds, because I wish non-Americans can say something about the TIP report. I'll say something very simple, but which I can give legal evidence of. The definition of trafficking used by the State Department does not meet international standards on trafficking. It's less progressive, it's less protective than the international definition of trafficking, because it puts at the center of its definition the need to characterize the force and the coercion, which is not exactly the case in Palermo Protocol, and which is not the case in many legislations in the world. So in many countries of the world, you have a much more legally protective and progressive definition of trafficking than the US definition of trafficking and than the definition used in this TIP report. And I think it's a big issue because I can give you examples of countries where US embassies put pressure on national parliaments so that they adapt their definition of trafficking in a less progressive way. So I can give to anyone evidences of that, but I think it's a huge challenge.
Ya, gracias. Buenas tardes. Justo a partir de lo que mencionaba Gregory, estaba pensando respecto a la definición de trata. Uno de los elementos importantes que, bueno, a partir de la experiencia de trabajo que he realizado con mujeres en situación de prostitución es descubrir que detrás de la trata de personas con fines de explotación sexual está la prostitución y la normalización de esta. Entonces, se ha hablado aquí sobre la prevención y que la motivación de los proxenetas son las ganancias económicas, pero no solamente es el dinero lo que mueve este negocio, sino como lo decía Melissa y lo decía Rachel, también detrás de este negocio lo que se encuentra es la violencia contra las mujeres y la desigualdad de género. Entonces, creo que esto es lo que va configurando también la trata de personas. Lo pienso porque desde que se configura o se institucionaliza la prostitución, pensemos a nivel histórico, desde las primeras leyes se institucionalizó, Código de Hammurabi y leyes mesoasirias. En la actualidad, la ley que tenemos de trata Representa un problema, por ejemplo, en mi país, en México, en el que algunas de las mujeres con las que yo he colaborado, cuando han querido denunciar, la ley nos marca que tiene que haber crimen organizado por cómo se ha constituido este delito a nivel internacional, y en muchos casos no se puede probar el crimen organizado, y entonces se llega a ir por lenocinio la denuncia y las mujeres no ven justicia porque no se mira el crimen organizado. Como Óscar Montiel lo comentaba, la forma de operar de algunos proxenetas no es desde la forma en la que concebimos estas organizaciones transnacionales, es una trata interna, a veces de un pueblo a otro pueblo, en el que no se valen de otros actores, sino son ellos mismos a través de mecanismos que son muy difíciles de probar legalmente por toda la manipulación emocional que hacen con las mujeres, y entonces en ese sentido la ley a veces llega a ser un impedimento. Entonces me parece un espacio muy importante para plantearlo, porque desde este panel creo que puede haber muchas aportaciones de cómo desde lo legal se podría resolver esto, porque esta ley nos marca una configuración de la víctima. Y entonces, ¿quién puede ser víctima? Desde mi punto de vista, cualquier mujer puede ser víctima potencial de trata por las relaciones desiguales de género en las que estamos viviendo. Entonces, sí me gustaría que se pudiera dialogar sobre esto, cómo podríamos hacer algunas adecuaciones para que la ley no vaya marcando o discriminando a mujeres que tal vez no son menores de edad, que no pueden probar que son víctimas y que por esto mismo son sancionadas, son excluidas del acceso a la justicia. Gracias.
I'll be quick. I feel like as a U.S. citizen, I have to say something about the TIP report. Many of us, John Miller, the first Trafficking in Persons ambassador in the U.S. State Department, and I know there's some people in this room who worked with him like I did. He was our hero. He was a Republican, and he was a human rights champion and a champion on behalf of trafficked and prostituted women. He quit the job because he was not permitted to tell the truth in this TIP report. It's as simple as that. Today, it continues to be a flawed and politically biased report. Take Germany and the Netherlands, they're ranked the highest level, despite large amounts of evidence that in any country where prostitution is legal, trafficking goes through the roof. This doesn't make any sense except if you understand that the Netherlands and Germany are political allies of the United States. It gets worse. We currently have a president who exhibits prototypical behaviors of sexual predators, including men who buy sex.
President Archer.
Hi. Well, my speciality is philosophy of the social sciences. And it's a very difficult point to put forward because it's not in defense of the USA or the TIP report, because there are many, many worse in the world. One of the worst is I don't think we have anybody from Australia here. One of the worst is the Walk Free Index. Now, you all know if we talk at the individual level and ask a simple question, do you prefer white bread to brown bread? If you get a non-response rate of 25%, that survey is valueless to anybody, medics, retailers, anybody. Now, this is just what the Australian report does. There is an obligation that many people will back up for each nation to submit a figure, will be a defective figure, we know that, but a figure to the UN about the number of trafficked persons per year. And there's a whole bunch of countries, so I will just talk about ASEAN, the 10 nations making up ASEAN, not one of which returns a report, a figure. and yet Walk Free thinks it can perform an exercise which is a disgrace to a 101 student, first year undergraduate, of saying, well, let's take countries that are very like ASEAN countries. ASEAN countries are very different among the 10. But let's just extrapolate from the rest of the world to ASEAN, and then we can make an entry. And this is just what it does. Now, metrification is one of the banes of the social sciences. It is never good enough. I've just cited you a really dreadful example, much worse than TIP, a really dreadful example of the misuse of statistics. What use are these figures? Last sentence. In terms of what we're here to address, I think it was Miria who said we have 40 million, best guesstimate, of trafficked persons loose in the world at the moment. Now, if the whole world agreed with what everybody in the street does agree with, prevention is better than cure, we would still have 40 million people to rehabilitate. They are all human beings. They all deserve decent treatment, good policies, good governmental and local support. And this is what we're here to do, to push the agenda forward, not to go on about our moral outrage or our bad metrics, but to move the agenda onwards, because some of the discussions we've been having, we had 5 years ago, and we had 3 years ago on criminalization. So this is about resettlement. Let's talk about what works for resettlement, because if we ended the practice tomorrow, complying with the SDGs, which I thoroughly approve of, we would still have these people on our consciences. They still have a right to a life, a decent life to live with decent work. And that's our job here during this meeting, to pinpoint some of the factors that are good practice and some that are done with the best will in the world, but for whatever reasons, they don't work. I can give you some examples, but not now, because we're on a time limit. Thank you.
You can always have more time, Margaret. Please.
Hi, my name is Rosy Orozco from Mexico. And it's exactly what the Senator Menendez was saying 2 years ago in the case of Mexico. It has been politicization in the case of Mexico. And exactly like it was Gregoire saying, if we will move towards what the GTIP report says about Mexico, we will even open the doors for some of the pimps that are already in jail, more than 1,000 pimps in jail. So I think GTIP report is now not with the objective it should have. Like, for example, it is not protecting the victims the way it should be. This workshop is for that purpose. I think any victim will need to be helped until they are successful, until they are completely protected, not to be in the hands of the traffickers again. And I'm sure this should be one of the most important parts of any report in the world. And of course, the laws, like my friends from Mexico and from Spain and from France, they should go all the way to zero tolerance. We have some states in Mexico that has closed completely all the places where there is slavery, sexual exploitation, and those states has down the rates of violence to women and also general violence. And I think zero tolerance means, of course, to punish and show, you know, these people that are the demand, the clients, but also, like my friend from Mexico was saying, to work with the traffickers. Our NGO works inside the jails, and it's possible to change their minds. Some of them has become activists, and 4 of them are publicly in media saying how the pimps operate. So I totally agree. We have to, in those reports, say how our countries working in jails to change the perpetrators, the victimizers, the pimps. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Ackerman.
A lot of problems, human problems, but I think we have to concentrate also. And prostitution is something, I think, in a patriarchal way, it diminishes women in general. And that's why I am for a clear statement, null tolerance for prostitution. And in our country, we had 1 year, in 2 years, we were having 91 witnesses, and we helped them in court cases. 91 witnesses of human trafficking. And we documented, it's one of our books here, we documented the court case from each, and with the number of the court case. And we have seen that human trafficking was not really taken seriously, because it was always said, oh, we never know, is that right, and think, it's awful. I gave it to a judge in Germany, a Catholic judge, I knew better. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, but that is not a good picture of German justice. So that was even before we had this miserable law to legalize prostitution. And now we open the doors for traffickers. And traffickers are the millionaires in our society. And people who has a lot of money had a lot of power. So I really find it very good that we find clear words about prostitution. We cannot tackle all the human problems. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to bring the discourse back to collaborations, and speaking more now about collaborations between states and civil society, and how we can strengthen civil society to be a partner of government. So my first question on this topic goes to the International Justice Mission, to Mr. Haugen. From your experience, how can we strengthen civil society stakeholders in countries where the government might not be your best partner because of corruption or because of challenges with budget? And what are some interesting and effective measures that you've observed or used to deal with corruptions within governments?
Yes, thank you. Great question. I think the most critical answer from our experience is there is no substitute for an effective state response to the challenge. So there will be no effective civil society substitute for that. Many times our sense of despair about the corruption and the brokenness of the public justice system, the public social services, will lead us to imagine that there may be some workaround to that. And we will do our best, perhaps, to fashion that. But at the end of the day, it's always been proven to be unsuccessful. So the first point of civil society, from our experience anyways, is that it needs to build a coalition of forces in these communities that strengthen the state capability. It is a coalition of forces to build awareness as to its brokenness, investment in what is required for it to operate, and this is both on the law enforcement side, but also on the social service capacity. Especially in states where the largest number of victims are, it's going to require a state response to that. But the state's response is largely driven by the priority that is expressed by the community. And the community is most powerfully expressed through its civil society organs and instruments. So that's my first response, is that in all the places where we have seen the most positive movement forward, it's been on the basis of the civil society vigorously requiring that there is an adequate state response. And that does mean rooting corruption out of it. Also, corruption is an entirely stoppable problem. The idea that we must despair of driving corruption even out of law enforcement is an unfortunate state of affairs. And so what's needed now are examples around the world where it's actually possible to transform it. So this is what has been IJM's focus, has been actually doing case studies where law enforcement was making lots of money off of trafficking, but now they've switched sides to now fighting trafficking. That transformation is actually possible, and we need, I think, more examples of how that works in different contexts to return hope and vigor to that indispensable fight, because it won't be won in the absence of a strong state response.
Thank you very much, Father Bailly.
Yeah, we've been very, very lucky. I've worked very closely with Sister Eugenia, and years ago she came to my parish to speak about it. She educated my parish. My parish was instrumental in paying for opening a shelter in Natuno and opening up a safe house in Lagos, Nigeria. Then she came and met with law enforcement, okay? Then I brought a congressional delegation to Rome to meet with Sister and to see what's possible and what's out there. Last year, we brought the governor and some more congressmen. And so by the time we were launching our efforts, the governor was telling everybody, you're going to make this happen. The judicial system has even set up a court for trafficking, you know, so in our children's court. We lead the nation in anti-trafficking legislation, and we have one particular senator who's been here twice who authored 28 different bills. Now, we've had some challenges and stuff like that, some legal challenges, but in our particular case, getting everyone on board before we, you know, got involved was very, very key. And now, and our particular facility deals with juveniles, because juveniles in the United States, for those of you, that's a nightmare. That's where militia groups come in, dealing with governmental regulations. Well, when the governor says, you're going to make this work, and if they need a waiver, you're giving them a waiver, and we're going to set up, you know, all the different Department of Children and Family Services. We're going to set up our own type of shelter just for the work that you're doing. It clears a lot, and you know, and now I'm not claiming to be the answer or having the great success, but having those people on board in the process of setting it up has been incredible. And then I go back to what President Archer said. We need to get the word out, even now. And I think the pulpit, and Abraham will probably agree with me, it's something we need to do. And when Cardinal Parolin talked about it, I'd love to see a national movement where we have trafficking ambassadors going out to the English-speaking countries, Spanish, French, German, whatever, and we get it in the pulpit. Once my people know about human trafficking. Thanks to Sister Eugenia, they've had an incredible effect and an incredible response, because they know. No one can hear the story and walk away unaffected. And I think that President Archer's suggestion is a tremendous one, and I think involving our leaders is also important.
Thank you very much. Dr. Vassiliadou.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up from Professor Archer. I think this is absolutely right. This is the spirit of the discussion today. So maybe we can draw some inspiration from the EU legislation. Some of the questions are, what can we do, what to do? Well, the EU law, for example, obliges our member states, the EU member states, to provide training for the judges, for the prosecutors, in order to best prosecute the cases, but also all frontline officials, because the most important thing to help the victims is to identify them. So this is what I tried also to say before. We need to become better at identifying the victims, including in the migration crisis and in the hotspots and what we are witnessing in Europe today. I'm talking only about Europe at the moment. We have published a study on high-risk groups, which is specifically on children, and where we have a number of recommendations for the member states, but also for civil society, on how best both to identify, but most importantly, to assist and reintegrate as relevant. What I tried to say in my speech, which I think we kind of undermine, is that victims of trafficking have rights internationally in most countries in the world, but I can say definitely in the EU that I would know more about. They have a lot of rights that are assigned to them by law. What stands between that and them accessing those rights is the implementation. So I think a lot of the work that we can do here is hold our governments and our member states accountable in order for those people, especially children, to be able to access those rights. Because one thing is to talk about the civil society always taking the burden to try and help and do and raise awareness and do everything they can. But at the end of the day, the best thing we can do is say, these are your rights, these are the possibilities, and let's see how best we can make use of them. There is a lot of funding available. Sometimes things don't work also when it comes to national referral mechanisms. This is the mechanism by which normally different government services get together in order to better identify and assist victims. If I ask civil society around the room, they know about this. All of them know about this. And sometimes they will say, yes, it's there, but it doesn't really work. So I think our job here is to see, not necessarily to reinvent things, because I think we do a lot already, but is to find ways to implement existing possibilities and use all the tools that are available in order for those people to access their rights. I don't necessarily believe in the estimates that were provided around the room today. I'm very careful of estimates. But if there is 1 million victims or 10 million victims, to me, the bottom line is that, as Professor Archer said, these are people that need to be directly helped. And all of the ones that have not been identified, to be identified. And we have a lot of possibilities around. So the best thing to do is use them.
Thank you. Minister Djaba.
Thank you. In Ghana, working with the IJM, we have been able to embark on various rescue missions with the anti-human trafficking unit of the police. The collaboration has really been effective, to the extent that we rescued over 112 children from the lakeside, and the Member of Parliament went out to say that we had kidnapped the children. And so I was put down in Parliament and in the news for kidnapping their children. So I invited her to go and visit the rescued children. And when she got there, she had a change of heart, because the children were in school, they were well fed, their rights were protected. And then she said to me that the kids were so happy, they didn't want to go back. So this is the type of work that we can do in a community to change the minds of people, collaborating with CSOs. My other issue is about money laundering, that human trafficking is linked to money laundering. The huge money makers in developed countries have a syndicate that goes and works into getting these rural people into domestic servitude. And that is part of the route where the demand and the supply meets, as well as the new demand for human organs, because people want to live longer. And so they will prey on these ignorant people from developing countries. So we must hit the nail on the head and understand that it's the supply and demand, and developed countries have a huge interest of laundering money. And that is something that people in this room must also address, not only the poverty in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you know you're sitting next to Mr. Anti-Money Laundering. I'd like to know if maybe Joseph has a response to that, or we'll just wait to hear from him tomorrow because he'll be speaking. Up to you.
Yeah, I'll give the time back because pretty much be addressing this in my speech tomorrow. But disrupting financial chains, I didn't coin that term, but it's kind of what you're getting at. And it's about just increasing the knowledge, and that there's a bigger supply chain going on here. And at the end of the day, it's demand's driving it, but the revenue generated from it, there's estimates all over the place, but it's definitely in the hundreds of billions around the world. If you start disrupting the financial chains, you will deal a significant blow to the traffickers, because they do this because they want money. They don't do it just because it's their pastime. They want the proceeds from it. So if you go after, if you seize, and if you give back to the victims, in terms of reparations, that could, not many nations are there yet, but that's definitely something we should explore more in this forum here, in terms of giving back to the victims the assets that are seized, because there's quite a bit of assets seized around the world.
Good. We're looking forward to learning more about this tomorrow. Ms. Morales.
Gracias. Vengo de Costa Rica, está en Centroamérica, y se supone que Costa Rica está llamado como uno de los países más felices del mundo. Definitivamente no puede ser más feliz del mundo si tenemos trata de personas y con fines sexuales, pero también tenemos trata de personas con fines de extracción de órganos. Y muchas cosas lindas que no se mencionan en esos informes del país más feliz del mundo. Mi punto es volver justamente al punto tema de esta reunión, y es hablar de las personas que fueron víctimas, que en este momento tenemos que ver cómo le vamos a llamar, pero en algún momento fueron víctimas. Nosotros hablamos, yo vengo de Fundación Rahab, tenemos 20 años de trabajar en esta área, somos pioneros en el país y en la región, y hemos visto en estos años que definitivamente la pobreza ha sido uno de los puntos que ha hecho vulnerables a estas personas para que sean atrapadas. Pero también tenemos, por otro lado, las personas que estamos trabajando con las personas vulnerables, porque la policía y las leyes no nos están protegiendo. Estamos trabajando contra crimen organizado. Eso es bien claro. Ellos nos están jugando. Cada persona que nosotros estamos sacando de las garras del comercio sexual, a alguien le está doliendo el bolsillo. Definitivamente van a querer defender su inversión o como le quieran llamar. Es muy triste porque son seres humanos. Pero también ahí está nuestra vida. Ahora, ¿cuál es el punto? Necesitamos tener la seguridad de que estas personas se van a levantar. Las que alguna vez fueron víctimas, que ahora son sobrevivientes o supervivientes, como le llaman también, puedan levantarse, pero que nosotros, los que estamos al frente y estamos trabajando, no quedemos destruidos, porque cada día estamos trabajando con el dolor humano, que es tan terrible. Yo tengo en este momento 3 amenazas de muerte. ¿Y cuál fue la respuesta de la policía? Fueron a ver mi casa, gracias a Dios vivo en un condominio que vivo segura, y eso fue toda la protección que tenemos. Creo que los que estamos aquí, la mayoría de las ONGs, estamos con un llamado superior. En mi caso fue porque Dios me llamó, por eso estoy en esto. Pero nosotros tenemos que tener mecanismos de protección a nivel internacional. No es posible que a nosotros nos amenacen y nos sigan para asesinarnos porque estamos sacando adelante a las personas que no tuvieron oportunidad en la vida. Entonces yo hablo por los que estamos atendiendo a las víctimas, que también nos hemos convertido también en víctimas de la sociedad que no nos protege, en víctimas de unas leyes que son muy laxas y tampoco nos protegen. Gracias.
Thank you. Ms. Dearlove.
I think when we look at our joint working with the state, we have to be really careful. It's so easy to be sucked into to be colluding with their lack of standing up to the responsibilities that they have legally, to the international responsibilities for responses that they have, because we need to remember that when they fund charities to provide their legal obligation, they are doing that because it's cheaper than providing it themselves, because they recognise that most charities will find extra money to do the extra things that are necessary. And there is a real danger that if we are not careful, we become part of shoring up a system that is inadequate. The reality is they take our voice because we cease to be able to challenge and speak for the voice of those who have no voice. And I think we have to be so careful about that. At its best, we find ways to work in partnership. And just as we do in families when we challenge each other and we encourage each other, and sometimes we fall out, we do that hopefully in truth with a hope that the best interests of those with the most vulnerability can be helped. So I think it's really, really important how we deal with that relationship so that we can challenge bad practice, that we can ensure that we are not saying it's okay not to give enough time for women or children or men who have been trafficked in order for them to either recuperate or to make decisions, that we don't end up in that system where we are using their statistics and their money to enable us as organisations to survive. Our focus, if it's being victim-centred, is to ensure that we don't lose our voice and that we don't stop telling the truth and asking the questions that need to be asked, even when they are incredibly uncomfortable. And those who know me will know I've done very well because I haven't actually spoken about prostitution in that, but I will.
With you 100%. If nonprofits and civil society are doing the role of the state, then they deserve the entire budget that should be allocated for that role. But you're preaching to the choir here, so. Grégoire.
Just to build on this, I would like to say I fully agree with Linda. We have to be extremely demanding and we have to build coalitions, as Mr. Haugen was saying, and that's what we did in France, and we were successful because we built a political rapport de force with the government. So we have to be very demanding. But also, and that's why I also fully support your point, and I'm really grateful that you made it, we should make sure that nothing that we do contribute to delegitimizing the states, because that's a huge global trend, and including in some NGOs, international NGOs, private foundations, etc., especially in North America, actually, there is a trend to attack the legitimacy of the states. And if the states are decreased in their legitimacy, we do not have any other democratic form of collective responses to our problems. So we have to be very demanding, we have to make our states accountable, but nothing in what we do should bypass the state, and we have to reinforce our state. And for that, I would like also to make an observation. We all make references to governments, but what about parliaments? Because the bulk of democracy is in parliaments, not in governments. And I think in our advocacy efforts, we should increase, in all countries of the world, increase our efforts towards parliaments, educating members of parliaments, lobbying members of parliaments, feeding members of parliaments with information, encouraging cross-party dynamics. Because when members of parliaments from several groups agree to set up an information committee, an information mission on a specific issue, and when they are convinced with their cross-party agreement, that becomes a powerful new social contract. That becomes a strong instructions for governments. And I know that more and more parliaments also are willing to increase their effort in terms of control of the laws and their implementation. So that's also evaluating this legislation which have been adopted. So I think we really have to focus on the bulk of democracy, which is parliaments, and then with parliaments building forces that help to make states accountable. But in any case, we should not bypass states in these pictures. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Sí, me olvidaba decirles, yo vengo de la Casa de la Mujer en Bolivia, una institución que tiene 27 años de servicio en la atención a víctimas de violencia y trata de personas, y algo que nosotros siempre caemos es a la hora de la asignación presupuestaria, y es que creo que necesitamos algún instrumento internacional con coercibilidad que obliga a los estados a establecer presupuestos para la aplicabilidad de las normativas. ¿Por qué? A ver, nosotros en el protocolo de Palermo nosotros lo ratificamos y manda al Estado a crear acciones para disminuir este delito, pero ¿qué pasa? Me crean la acción, me crean una ley integral que yo sin dudar diría que es la mejor en América Latina, mi normativa creada en el 2012, pero no me dan presupuestos, no me dan un peso, entonces yo no la puedo aplicar. ¿Cómo voy a hacer, díganme ustedes, la prevención, la atención, la sanción al agresor, la restauración a las víctimas si no tenemos dinero, si no tenemos presupuesto? Entonces, nuevamente le asumimos este rol y esta tarea a las ONGs, que cada vez nos vemos con mayores recortes de recursos, en Bolivia especialmente, que Bolivia ya está considerado como un país de renta media. Pero ¿qué hacemos nosotros con las más de 20 mujeres, 20 víctimas de violencia que tengo todos los días en mi puerta? Entonces, nuevamente creo que las normativas que se van aplicando, que se van aprobando, tienen que establecer de dónde se va a sacar el presupuesto para que sea aplicable. Porque si no, ¿cómo van a demostrar la voluntad política? A mí no me sirve de nada juntarme con los parlamentarios, juntarme con ellos si es para una foto. Entonces, ¿cómo ellos me van a demostrar su voluntad política? La voluntad política se demuestra con asignación de recursos económicos para poder realizar la tarea de prevención, de atención y de restauración a las víctimas, porque si no, no se puede lograr. Una ONG, todas las personas que estamos acá con la voluntad que tenemos, no vamos a resolver el problema, un problema que le corresponde al Estado, porque es deber del Estado la protección de sus ciudadanos. Gracias.
Sorry, the translation was still going on. Please.
Sí, gracias. Totalmente de acuerdo con Paula. Y bueno, ya aprendí, tengo que hacer la pregunta directa para que me respondan. Quisiera decir que sobre el protocolo de Palermo, en México al menos se da que hay una ansia, ¿no? Como una prisa por aprobar el protocolo después de su ratificación. Entonces se viene una ley nacional y luego de las leyes nacionales hay leyes locales en los estados y luego está una reglamentación y luego hay programas para la ejecución. Entonces, esto más sumado a los informes que se dan en Estados Unidos, se privilegia más a los números que a las personas, ¿no? Entonces yo lo que estoy mirando es que hay una ley, pero hay una realidad muy diferente. Y la pregunta es para Gary Haugen. Él nos hablaba de la erradicación a partir de un diagnóstico. Quisiera conocer los puntos de la metodología que él propone y los países donde se han implementado y sobre todo si hay algunos documentos publicados, porque nosotros en México estamos haciendo diagnósticos a partir de la conformación de nuevas teorías, ¿sí? Si bien estoy de acuerdo con la compañera que se acaba de ir, que tenemos una ley y esa ley es la que debemos aplicar, la realidad va más allá, más rápido. Y yo creo que la creación de conceptos teóricos es una posición política también, ¿no? Entonces, además, una ley no nos debe cortar la creatividad de los científicos sociales, ¿no? Para crear nuevos conceptos. Gracias.
You wanted something extra putting in the budget, and I think you're absolutely right on that, 100%. I want something taking off it. Is Marila, oh no, she's had to go out. I just have to say, some countries in Europe, quite a few of them, add to their GDP, gross national product, gross domestic product, doesn't matter what you call it, the profits from both the drug trade and human trafficking. Now, this has knock-on economic effects in the sense that it makes the country look better off, and therefore its financial exchange rate against other countries is more favorable to it. But it is entirely deceptive if we think this is a completely immoral set of activities, and it should come off that budget. So what the state is doing, to go back with where Gary started, which I fully agree with actually, civil society has to some extent at least, quite a big extent, work through the state, at least today, then one of the things it could do, which would not cost anything other than effort, is to get these items excluded from national budgeting. Because it should not make an exchange rate more favorable to a country just because it's included a couple, at least, of immoral practices in it. Now, are you still there, Frank? I don't know whether the products of organ harvesting get grossed up into GDP, GNP, but if they do, this would be a third thing to come off the metrics.
Grégoire, please.
Just would like to share an information about that. We have released in France, in response exactly to what you denounce, we have released the first domestic estimate of the economic and social cost of prostitution and trafficking. And what we have shown is that prostitution and trafficking does not increase the wealth of a country, but actually increase only the social costs. And there is a privatization of profits into the hands of traffickers and a socialization of costs. And it's even more true in Europe because most of the traffickers come from abroad, and thus they take that money, which is the consumption from the domestic buyers, is taken abroad and of course does not go through taxes or national consumption, so through money laundering, etc. So we have assessed that. It's available in English. It's called Prost-Cost. And I think it's extremely interesting to extend those kind of studies where we can evidence that actually it does not increase the wealth, but increase only the social cost, plus the human costs, etc. So there is an economic argument, and that also is very helpful for the assistance we bring to the victims, because we can explain why it's even economically more rational to invest in the prevention, invest in education, invest in the rehabilitation today, and thus have the means to decrease the phenomenon instead of having to face year after year the consequences of what we don't address. So I think it's powerful. The estimation of the economic and social cost of trafficking and prostitution is a powerful element to bring in.
Is the data that you're quoting exclusively for France, or is it wider?
That was only for France, but that gave a lot of insights about the money dynamics. What is the turnover? What are the costs exactly? Where does this money end up? Not in the hands of the victims. How can we confiscate those assets? How can we repair the victims, etc.? So that's really helped. Bringing that economic dimension helped so much to convince, for example, technocrats or governments who had not understood that even economically speaking and not only ethically speaking, it was worth addressing that challenge today in a proactive manner instead of facing it.
Could I just add another point to take your analysis a bit further? Normally, the budgeting and the approval of budgets and finance goes through a parliamentary system. And the discussion so far about interstate level collaboration involving parliaments from different parts of the world is quite important, because that dynamic of parliamentary authority can then help to keep in check the way in which governments budget and plan their budgets. So effectively, not only are you bringing transparency to the process and very valuable cost-benefit analysis, but equally, you're bringing an empowerment which may not have been articulated in quite the clarity that you've done it, to the way in which a parliamentary system or its equivalent may work. And I think that's another way of bringing in the broader constituency, beyond just simply the experts who know about this, into the political process, where the benefits and the cost is then part of a political discussion. And I think that's a really valuable tool. So thank you for that intervention.
Joseph, please.
Bringing government and state involved in the conversations, it's extremely important. There's certain things that were discussed in terms of not being complacent, but they're comprised of us, the people, so we need to include them in our conversation. To bring a biblical verse into this, ask and thou shalt receive. It's simplistic, but from my perspective, it really made a difference. And I learned this from Peter Warwick, who was the originator of Project Protect. And Peter Warwick, I learned a lot from this individual. He served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles as a police officer, and he also served in the British military before that. And what I learned from Peter is that he's very direct. He's a refined man, but he could be authoritative when he needs to be. And he would look people in the eye and say, well, what are you going to do about it? And if there's one thing that everyone's kind of unified on, it's bipartisan, it's that human trafficking should end and it's bad. So Peter would, we would leverage our contacts, and he would say, how can you assist? How can you help? And it kind of caught on like a contagion. It was truly organic and grassroots, because then those individuals start asking their colleagues and their counterparts, what will you do about it? And through this questioning and this asking, we saw our federal police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, appoint a human trafficking officer to a newly formed office. We saw the province of Ontario, the largest province in Canada, earmark $72 million to combat human trafficking. We saw the Project Protect I'll speak about this tomorrow, be mentioned at the United Nations. Their General Assembly just happened. All of these things that when we initially started, we had not planned, but through the simple gesture of asking, it came back to us. And I think if no one here looks shy, and you all look like you're doing your own part within your own countries, but I can't stress the importance of the simple ask of what will you do to make human trafficking, contribute to the end of human trafficking. And you'd be surprised at the response that you'll get from that simple question.
Thank you. Mr. Haugen, you had your hand up.
Just to share with Mr. Torres as a response that we have developed now a methodology that we've written out from our experience about justice system transformation and how that goes about, and it's been evaluated in various tests by outside evaluators, and so we would be delighted to share that with him and other members of the group if they wish to be in touch with us.
Thank you. I think it is good to note that civil society and usually smaller nonprofits are often so busy doing what they're trying to achieve that they don't have time to document and to share that information. So it's important when we have larger civil society organizations that they do the measurement and that they do disseminate in multiple languages. Father Behe.
Yeah, I don't know what Gary and Corbin's experience is, but ours ask and you shall receive a procedural policy norm that's 465 pages. Government involvement in this, because we're an NGO, the regulatory issues are just insurmountable, okay? And in our home, we have a chapel. We have a candle for the Blessed Sacrament. That was a huge issue, having a candle in there, okay? I mean, and it's that sort of thing that when my experience has been, there is money available, but they take over. I mean, they dictate what you can serve for breakfast, literally. I'm not making that up. And for us, it became so overwhelming that, we're privately funded, and trying to get NGOs, but we're trying to receive. And then the other thing is that, there's some medical procedures that we have to perform if we receive government money and we're not willing to do. We're not going to save one child and kill another. So our experience, because we went through every state, local, went through all of them, the control that they have over that, and this is my American experience, has been insurmountable. We had to walk away from it.
Thank you, Minister Dejava.
Thank you. The citizens of every nation belong really to government. Government is supposed to protect the citizenry. The sons and daughters of any nation are to be protected by the government. However, in African countries, we're saddled with a lot of debt. And to eradicate or prevent this phenomena, you need to invest money. The budgets that we have, for example, my ministry is one of the smallest. We have about $63.7 million, and only $13.7 million is for all the other activities in the ministry. And the area of human trafficking will get maybe about $2 million or less. So it's difficult to address the issue of human trafficking in terms of desensitization. We have a Ghanaian dream. We have expectations of our children. They must live in hope. We want them to be confident and to feel good about being Ghanaian. However, their parents are not educated. About 63% of rural Ghana is not formally educated. We're now bringing in a program of free SHS so that education from basic to senior school level will be free. But the parents are not educated. They can't read their rights because the rights are in English and they speak the dialects. And so even if you did the laws in the dialects, they don't read the dialects. So I want to propose that governments with huge debts must be given some kind of relief so that the monies that are coming from the relief could be used to address social issues like human trafficking or ending child marriage or what have you. And then the other part of it is that the laws, the legislature, the policies should be done in voice, in the dialects, so that our people can understand that these are rights and these are responsibilities. For instance, in the area of child marriage, in my country, some people think that is an honor, but there is a fine in the law that says that if you are part of, you engage in child marriage or human trafficking, you are fined 500 Ghana or 1 year imprisonment. But they don't know that because they don't read English. Thank you.
Thank you, please.
Gracias. Respecto al trabajo con el Parlamento y los gobiernos, quería compartir un poco de la experiencia que he tenido últimamente también como, no solo como investigadora, sino también como profesora dando diferentes cursos y diplomados a gente que trabaja dentro del gobierno y que toma decisiones. Y una de las cosas que es lamentable y que he descubierto es que son personas que han tomado muchos cursos, que a partir de que México ratifica el protocolo de Palermo se han invertido muchísimos recursos económicos en la capacitación y sensibilización constante de las personas que están dentro del gobierno. Pero a pesar de todos estos cursos y todas las capacitaciones que han tenido y que incluso te recitan la ley de trata a la perfección, y también han tomado cursos para la identificación de víctimas, y lo que es lamentable es que cuando llega una víctima a presentar una denuncia, el primer parámetro que tienen es si llega golpeada o si es menor de edad. Si no cumple con estos requisitos, inmediatamente se empieza a dudar si es una víctima, y nos han llegado incluso a comentar ministerios públicos que están especializadas o especializados en trata, que lo que pueden hacer es darles dinero para que tomen un taxi y se regresen a su casa. Esa es una realidad que vivimos constantemente. Entonces nos muestra que aunque tengamos la ley y que tengamos protocolos de actuación y que las personas que se encargan de la procuración de justicia conozcan esta ley, eso no implica que se aplique. Entonces, esto nos lleva a pensar que más allá del avance legal también se requiere un avance en el cambio de las mentalidades. Pensando como antropóloga, ¿no? Desde un análisis social, Lo que nos plantea la ley es un cambio en lo social. Tenemos esta ley, pero eso no implica una transformación cultural ni una transformación de la forma de pensar. Estos son cambios de larga duración y para lograr estos cambios tenemos que apostarle a los procesos formativos que van más allá de las capacitaciones sobre lo legal. Y quiero poner un ejemplo. También he trabajado haciendo peritajes en antropología para establecer la relación entre trata, desaparición y feminicidio y en casos de feminicidio. Y una de las cosas que hemos visto es que, por ejemplo, el año pasado empezó a haber diferentes feminicidios, bueno, muchos casos de feminicidios en el estado de Puebla, y todos tenían una particularidad, eran de mujeres que estaban embarazadas. Y entonces, al empezar a analizar qué sucedía con esto, lo que descubrimos, nuestra hipótesis, es que con el avance de los derechos de las mujeres y que tenemos una ley que se llama Ley General de Acceso a las Mujeres a una Vida Libre de Violencia, entonces tenemos ciertos derechos que están garantizados y que incluso cuando se habla de las pensiones de alimentos ni siquiera es un derecho de las mujeres, es un derecho de los hijos y las hijas. Entonces una mujer al poder demandar que el padre se haga responsable de su paternidad se convierte en una amenaza, porque entonces puede denunciar y aquel que no se quiera hacer responsable pierde sus privilegios. Y entonces, ¿qué hace? La mata. Entonces, esto es un ejemplo claro de cómo el que tengamos una ley no garantiza que exista justicia, que ésta se cumpla, que las personas conozcan sus derechos y que exista una sensibilización no solamente para quienes aplican las leyes, sino también para quienes forman parte de la sociedad, porque la ley representa un atentado contra pues, quien está, digamos, violando esta ley. Y pensaba en esto como a partir de lo que ustedes comentan del trabajo con los parlamentos, de las negociaciones y de lo que se puede hacer y que me parece que es necesario, pero que tendríamos que pensar también de qué manera podríamos darle un enfoque que no solamente parta de que tengamos los instrumentos, sino de que estos instrumentos se les mire desde una perspectiva diferente y por perspectiva hablo de los lentes, ¿no? Como la ley tiene vacíos, los protocolos tienen vacíos y se trata muchas veces de interpretarlos. Y en la manera en la que los interpretamos, a veces únicamente se sigue la norma, pero pocas veces se logra la justicia.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the fact that a lot of you have traveled a long way to be here and might be getting a little bit sleepy. But I just want to touch upon one more question, and I'll open this question up to everybody because I'm curious to hear the response. But it relates to the fact that now we're in the year 2017. Technology has very much changed. We're dealing with a culture of youth some of whom may not remember a time before the internet. They may not remember a time before social networks. We're seeing in specific countries like Kenya and also a lot of Asian countries, mobile money is very prevalent. We have the capacity to send funds person to person. We have Bitcoin. We have all these new technologies. And my question is to the panelists and to everybody, what are some examples of how you are utilizing this new technology to fight human trafficking? Corbin.
So I think that, from Humanity United's perspective, we firmly believe that technology is a critical component needed to fight trafficking. And so because of this, we have worked to invest in various tech innovations being used to combat trafficking. I do want to make the point that I think it is important to acknowledge that, technology is not going to solve the issue by itself. The reality is, I think, whether you're talking about a particular policy or a particular tool, there's no such thing as the one answer that's going to solve trafficking. So, when we're having discussion about prevention or, versus this, that, or the other, I think that we have to take a holistic approach, that it's going to take a bunch of different things. But technology certainly is something that is very important. Last year, Humanity United held a competition for technology solutions to help identify and address labor trafficking in global supply chains. We certainly have talked a lot about sex trafficking. I think it's also important to acknowledge here the importance of tackling labor trafficking. And I think in particular, when you're looking at tracking products through very complex global supply chains, I think we can do a lot better, and I think technology can be a very important tool to help. I think another way that we have helped on the technology side is looking to locate and provide immediate shelter services for trafficking victims, and then also looking to leverage some of the new blockchain technology and other open data sources, again, to be able to track products through the supply chain. So moving forward, I hope that, whether it's looking at the EU or the US or other international or global bodies, I think that the next big frontier in the fight against trafficking is addressing global supply chains. And I think that there is a lot more that can be done, and we really need to start taking that seriously.
Yeah, I asked that question specifically because I see that technology and artificial intelligence is being used to scrape Facebook and social networks, looking for terrorism, acts of terrorism, looking for evidence of certain types of other crimes, but I don't really see a lot of it being used in anti-human trafficking. Stella and then Gregoire.
In Nigeria, for example, I think I know that the central bank and the banks work hand in hand with NATIP to see whether they can trace any form of funds that come into the system. And even internally, if you have money up to a certain amount you transfer, generally they have to find out what's the source or what the individual is doing to be able to raise such funds to put in. And they are more focused on money that comes from outside, so which also goes to checkmate the traffickers in returning their funds. And we found out that most of our big traffickers are based abroad, not within the system. The ones we have within the system are the smaller ones. And so I think that using the little technology they have in the banking sector, they're able to trace the funds of traffickers, but not as much as they would have if they were based in Nigeria. They are based abroad, in Europe, and all over the world. Jumping a little bit, please, from this. The state has a major role to play, but please, civil society has the most critical role to play in prevention. Yes, funds come in. Let me use Nigeria. I'm not talking of other countries. I use my country. In Nigeria, we have NATIP. Money comes to, says, in quote, is for NATIP to operate. But the money is domiciled in government. It's not purely corruption. Bureaucracy forestalls the use of the money. NATIP DG cannot sign more than $1,200 on her own. She must refer it to a committee set to manage the trust fund, and the trust fund controls all the money, both budgetary allocation and money coming from outside for trafficking. So what we are advocating is this: as much as we know government is accountable, they are accountable for their people, but for the message to get down to the rural communities, we need the NGOs, because we have had this all along. What the EU should do to my country, I'm not talking of other countries, please, education, we should focus on putting the topic, trafficking, in the educational system, no matter the level, to be taught both in primary, secondary, the two most important levels, at the lowest level. Thank you.
Stella Gregoire.
I just wanted to say that if we want to touch the issue of the new technologies, we have to acknowledge first that so far, new technologies have facilitated trafficking and not harmed trafficking. I think it's very important because there is a lot of willingness to frame new technologies as a powerful tool, which it could be. It's only a mean, but it has profited. And I like the expression of one of the speakers earlier saying that trafficking wants to make money where it's easiest and safest. And trafficking online is easier and safer. It's easier because it does not require logistics, far less logistics. You just have to advertise the picture of the person you want to traffic, and you don't need the traditional logistics. So easier and safer because the legal impunity of the traffickers is higher online than in real life, because those who host and edit those contents refuse to be held accountable for those contents. So that's what we see with Backpage in the US, with Viva Street in Europe and all over the world. So I think it's a mean, so it's not good or bad, that's a tool, but we have to acknowledge that so far they have made a much more strategic use, the traffickers of new technologies that we have, and that so far it has benefited, and also that the main players of the new technologies have a huge responsibility in that, and that so far they are not ready to address it. They don't want to see boundaries in the way they operate with new technologies because they're afraid of losing their capacities to edit and host content. So I think it's a huge challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, I hear your point on the ISPs, the internet services providers, the social networks. They absolutely do not want to be held accountable. But if they are facilitating these crimes, they need to be prosecuted as facilitators. And I'm starting to see some legislation emerge from the financial sector that if there's a recent case I'm following, for example, against PayPal, because PayPal has been alleged to have been facilitating a Ponzi scheme. And there's a class action currently against them related to that. The same argument works with anti-trafficking, anti-human trafficking. Minister Dejaba.
In Ghana, social media has become a huge instrument for reporting. And the WhatsApp, the Facebook. I was in Côte d'Ivoire when I got a call that a child was being married off. And it took a phone call to the anti-human trafficking unit to get to the community and stop it. Another time, I was outside Ghana and I got a call on WhatsApp that a child was being kidnapped in terms of trafficking, and that intervention came about. So we are putting in a single entry call center called the Helpline of Hope, so that it's a toll-free line, and you can call and we will respond to you. We're launching it in December. And I'm thinking that with what you're saying about the online, there needs to be regulation by governments to ensure that people don't use online services in the area of trafficking and other abuses. Governments should take that into consideration. In the YouTube, we can design documentaries that can be put, because rural Ghana can't read properly. So if we put it in documentaries to them on the YouTube, almost everybody in rural Ghana, as well as Africa, has a mobile phone. So it will be easy for them to access it on the YouTube or any other format that is in the form of drama and what have you. Thank you.
Thank you. We keep coming back to the same issue. I believe you probably already have telecommunications legislation in Ghana that specifically prohibits use of these mechanisms for fraud or for criminal activity. It's the devil is in the enforcement. Last word of the evening, Ms. Farley.
Oh, thanks. I'll be quick. It's fabulous to hear about these anti-trafficking tools on the web and the use of the internet to educate people. I want to put out a request for help from this group of people, because the other thing that's happened on the web is the creation of fake news, which those of us in the US have been extremely painfully aware of. But this is happening in our field as well. You have these so-called AstroTurf campaigns, which are fake grassroots campaigns that make up entire movements, people, ideas, and probably the worst example is, are you familiar with Wikipedia? Do you know that this is one of the worst places to get facts? For example, some of us who miserably have Wikipedia pages put up on us are unable to correct the facts. There are robots that sweep through Wikipedia reverting facts. And one of the tactics that's used is to marginalize and controversialize us in our movement. We're a human rights movement. We simply want the right for women to exist in the world without prostitution. Not a lot to ask in terms of basic human rights, but we're pushed by a series of adjectives and descriptions of our research, of our political actions, of our social movements in the case of space. We're pushed into a marginalized, weird corner, and I am serious when I say we need help. So thanks for thinking about that over the course of the next couple days.
Okay, colleagues, it's been a rich and rewarding afternoon, and thank everyone for their patience and the timeliness of their interventions. We can now go to dinner and be refreshed with further conversation over dinner for tomorrow, yet another day in which to discuss a very important topic. Thank you very much, and to Jamie for doing such a fantastic job. Excellent. Well done. It's worked very well. Really worked well.